welcome all of you to today's talk by Amherst College alum Paul Ackerman, who's sitting here in the front, a class of 1958. As this talk today will reveal, and I hope, Paul, you'll agree with me, maybe you'll disagree, Paul's interest in human expression informs not only his very accomplished career as a psychoanalyst, but also his keen eye for art in his collecting and in his own work. Over the past few months, I've had the great pleasure of working with Paul to plan this talk. In addition to learning about his fascinating life and his love for the arts, I've really been struck with Paul's generosity and commitment to the college. He and his wife, who's Sandra, she's back there, have traveled from Los Angeles to be here today, so they had a long trip to be here, and I hope that each of you will have the chance to introduce yourselves to Paul and to Sandra, who I'm sure would love to meet you. Paul's talk will be followed by a reception at the Mead Art Museum, which will include the opportunity to look at a number of Paul's early photographs in the museum study room, and also some are displayed on our galleries as well, and to ask him any questions you may have about his work. So this won't be necessarily Paul's going to talk, but then afterwards we'd like to invite you all to the receptions for some wine and cheese and nibbles, but also to have a chance to talk to Paul and to discuss his art and to see it in person, which I think makes a big difference. PowerPoint can only go so far. So without further ado, I'd like to hand off the introduction to Professor Justin Kimball, Chairman of the Department of Art and the History of Art at Amherst College. Justin will give us a bit of background on the history of street photography, which I think will be quite useful in providing a framework for Paul's early photographs of urban New York City life.
Hello. Thanks for coming out on this blustery day. Yeah, that'd be great. So I was honored to be asked to talk or give some context for Paul's work that he's going to be showing us this evening. I thought the best way to do that was to maybe show some photographs from the history of photography, about 40 years worth, and I'm just going to show a couple of photographs by a couple of different people that will, I think, give some context to not only the time that Paul was making these pictures, but the evolution of street photography within that period of time. And again, I'm just hitting a couple of the greats. There were many people working during this time. So that's a pointer, that's my advance. So this first photograph is made probably 12 years before Paul was making some of the pictures that he's going to be showing today. Those pictures, Paul will talk about some of this, I'm sure. This picture was made in the late 30s by Walker Evans. And although not strictly what we think of as street photography now, it was, and really, again, I'm talking mostly about American photographers here. He was one of the first photographers who was sort of out there making work that in his mind was about sort of having us look at the American scene or what was happening in American culture that wasn't part of popular culture. And so in here, this picture is made in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And basically he's sort of he often used architecture. There are sometimes people in his pictures and sometimes not, but for my money, some of the great ones are photographs like this, where we're seeing in the very background the factories, in the middle where the people live, and in the foreground where they end up. And so we have this entire community which exists within this one place. Backwards. Another Evans photograph. Again, maybe one with a little bit more sense of humor. Again, using both the sort of houses that would be built just like each other, and advertising also sort of making a joke on the eyes and the two eyes in the house. Photograph made outside of New York City. I think it's actually New Jersey. And so these photographs, again, are considered to be more documentary photography, and most of the photographers I'm going to show you up into the 50s were photographers who worked often for magazines and worked often doing picture stories. And Evans was one of the first people to sort of step out of that. And his good friend, Helen Levitt, who photographed in her neighborhood on the street on the Lower East Side where she lived, I think from about 1937 until she died about 4 years ago in the same apartment, 5-story walk-up, made these photographs in her neighborhood. And for her, I think it was much about being out on the street and looking at the young people as a kind of reflection of what was going on with older people. So them acting out the things that they were seeing in some ways. in the world around them. And then out of those photographers comes Robert Frank, who was making pictures just about the same time across America that Paul was making his pictures in the early 50s on the street of New York. And this one happens to be, this one's in Hoboken, New Jersey. And he steps away from Evans a little bit, and even though they were great friends, and Evans was a huge influence on him, he steps away from Evans a little bit and really starts looking at what he feels like the problems with America are. And he's a Swiss photographer who shows up here in like 1949 or 50, and starts looking around the country and seeing that it's not the country he suspected it was when he came here as an immigrant, and you know, above all the shiny stuff, the atomic nuclear family that was sort of happening at the time, he's looking around and finding an America that is unseen, which is obviously what this picture is about in some ways. This is a picture from a trolley car in New Orleans, and we clearly see the segregation that's going on here, and very sweetly those two kids, the man who looks like he's in pain, the African-American man looking like he's in pain, and sort of mean lady, and all these little dreams above their head, which is quite lovely. And in the middle of his book, which is a well-known book, The Americans, we come to this photograph, which is a picture made in Los Angeles of this, you know, Cadillac underneath this shiny thing with a couple of trees here. And if we had any doubt what his work was about, again, this is right in the middle of the book, you have this picture, and then you turn the page, and you have this picture, which is in Arizona, a body at a highway accident, and those people like the trees. It's winter, and it's snowing a little bit in Arizona, which is kind of crazy, but it is. And it's all right there, the haves and the have-nots in some way. And so I think we'll see in Paul's pictures that one of the things that he's pointing at, and I found really interesting to look at, that here's this young guy, these are accomplished photographers who were out there making work in the early 50s. Paul is a teenager, essentially, and has really got his finger on the pulse of the same kind of subject matter in some ways, is really looking at what's going on the streets of New York as a kind of representation of a kind of unseen part of the world, or an unseen part of certainly our culture, in a time where, you know, it's post-World War II, we're celebrating ourselves in a lot of ways, but the reality of what that means, the haves and the have-nots, is quite different from what is being publicized at the time. And so for these pictures, and then there's a big shift. In the 60s, there are a bunch of photographers, 3 in particular that I'm going to show you now, who start they start thinking, they're again all magazine photographers. I'm going to show you Deanne Arbus, who was a fashion photographer, Friedlander, who was a jazz and folk music photographer to make a living, and Gary Winogrand, who made this picture, who also did a lot of commercial work and a lot of picture stories. And at a certain point, they got tired of making photographs that were about an external view of an external world. And they started making pictures that were more about, and I'm quoting John Zarkowski here, who was a longtime curator at the Museum of Art, paraphrasing really. They start to become more about an interior view of an exterior world. They become very personal, and they become about a combination of what's going on out there and a reflection of themselves off of their subject in some way. And so this is this, you know, great picture by Gary Winogrand, where you have this broken person here, which is usually in his photographs. His pictures become about sort of the hysteria of the world in some way, right? And this is on Hollywood and Vine. And this is in Central Park. And of course, in this picture, it's like, who's the wolf, this guy? Or, right? I mean, the light is just perfect, right? I always like to show this picture because it's a simple one, but often people talk about street photography as sort of happenstance, people just being out there photographing, making things happen by accident. And that Winogrand sort of proves to us that that wasn't true. And in a simple picture like this, you know, we think about the Sistine Chapel, right? We think about that sort of dropping hand of God to touch something else. He is definitely referring to the history of painting in this picture, right? He's just changed the figures. He's changed the constituency in some way. And that's just a funny one. I love this kid right in here, like You know, most people would be, oh, God, I didn't keep the head. Winogrand loves that you knocked the head off there, right? Another Winogrand picture. Perhaps one of my favorite Winogrand pictures, made on the Santa Monica Pier, pretty near to when Winogrand died of cancer in the 80s, and he was out in Los Angeles making these photographs pretty close to before he died. And I love it, this laughing couple. I've seen the print of this, and it's hard to see here, but this couple's laughing hysterically, and they're in the light. And of course, this is like the walk of death, and there's this old guy pulling himself up at the end, and there's Winogrand right in the middle, his shadow up there. It's a pretty terrific photograph. And these are Deanne Arbus. So there's always lots of discussion. All of these pictures are made in New York. I'm going to show you a couple from the street. She would often meet people on the street and then talk them into going back to their apartments and photographing them and getting them to take their clothes off. And she was wild. Yeah, she would do anything. But for her, in a way, everyone's a little broken, right? And she kept trying harder and harder to sort of find those people. And in many ways, I think, identify with them. You know, this picture is not at all about who this kid probably is or what he's about. But in this moment, you know, it's just crazy with that little hand grenade and that unbelievable fist and those knees. And, you know, the crazy face, but of course, it's made by that little thing dropped off of there, right? And all that beautiful light back here, it makes it kind of nutty. And in the end of her book, or in the middle of her book, I'll show you, these are the last two pictures I have. In the middle of her book, you come to this picture of the Jewish giant in his apartment in New York. And then you turn the page, and there's a picture made 10 years later, which is this picture. And when I first saw this, it killed me. Because I was like, first of all, it's this thing that I believed happened, and I could never actually prove. But this thing about persistence of vision, right? That you might make the same picture 10 years later, right? To her, it doesn't matter if she's photographing that person or she's photographing the boxes that she thinks they should, right? People are odd, and she believes that that's true, that her psychology tells her that that's true. And for her, that's all what it's about. And it doesn't matter what the subject is, it's about things not fitting in some way. So that's the last picture I had. Oh, no, I lied. I got a couple more. I'll go through these quickly, and then it's Paul's turn. These are Lee Friedlander, and they perhaps have a little bit more humor to them. And he is playing a game with himself constantly where he's using the world, but it's all about him playing this game with himself. He has a couple of books of self-portraits that's Lee in the middle, where he sort of Mondrian's himself there. That's his head on the back of that woman's. Right? So, and this is a totally different kind of photography, a street photography, that's completely about him and not so much about the world. Really it is about the world, but it's also about him playing and seeing how many different things he can make happen. Isn't that terrific? I mean, who doesn't? You know? So that, in fact, is my last picture. And so I guess at this point, what I'd like to do is just welcome Paul and say thank you, and look forward to seeing pictures.
I am happy to be back at Amherst and appreciate having been asked to give this presentation. Thank you, Vanya Malloy and the staff at the Mead, for your patience and support. It's good to be among friends. The rich gifts of the arts allow us to more meaningfully experience times, places, people, and emotions. For example, as an Amherst freshman, I suffered through Bucky Salmon's History of Western Civilization. Reading Thompson and Johnson textbook was sleep-inducing and grim torture. Years later, as art became an important part of my life, I wanted to learn more about the historical, cultural, economic, and political climate that existed when the art was created. Formerly boring historical books are now stimulating reading. Art and both the social and physical sciences enrich each other. Until recently, if anyone would have said that I'd be here talking about photography, I would have laughed and probably said 2 words beginning with the letters B and S. I knew little about photography, but this is what happened. Several years ago, an Amherst classmate and his wife, an art curator, visited us in Los Angeles. Norm and Carolyn Carr were interested in seeing our collection of American art. They are knowledgeable collectors of vintage photography, and Norm himself is a talented photographer. We were given a catalog of their extraordinary collection titled Chance Encounters, and for me, it was eye-opening. Last spring, I found some photo negatives that I had taken when I was 15. Both Lizzie Barker, then the director of the Mead, and Norm Carr were enthusiastic about exhibiting the work. The opportunity to do this presentation reawakened my interest in photography. Lizzie suggested that in addition to the 1952 images, I should show selections from our art collection, my own paintings, and the street photography done this year. In preparing this talk, I've thought about how different activities inform each other. As a teenager, I enjoyed painting and graphic arts. I bought a second-hand Rolleiflex and some darkroom equipment. The camera is a single lens reflex. It has no telephoto lens. And in doing candid photography, it was challenging as I had to get up close and personal. Shooting from the waist is less intrusive than when you have a big lens aimed at somebody, but you still need to be bold, not shy. Later, I went to Amherst, then to Yale Medical School, and became a psychoanalyst, which is both an art and a science. These are happy little children in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. You can see the L behind them, the L train. They're gossiping and having a good time, I guess. Here I come. Whoops. Okay. This is kind of tricky. At least I didn't hit the blackout button. It's 3 generations of an Italian family in Brooklyn. The grandmother's giving me a warm smile. The mother's kind of glaring at me, gimlet-eyed. And this little girl is bursting through the door as if to announce the 3rd generation. When I first blew this picture up as a teenager, I just blew up the little girl. I thought that she was the heart of it, but I subsequently learned better. A couple of Bowery workers. My brother gives a good shine. What I think makes this picture work is the circular arrangement of the figures, which draws the eye right into the image, and the smug, self-satisfied smile on the man's face. The conversation in the Bowery. Now look at this guy. You wonder about all the people who ended up in the Bowery. And when I saw this picture, I thought of that actor, Charles Durning. You can't quite tell from this picture, but it's pretty close. And Miss Sunshine is all gums and teeth and a smile that just warms our hearts. In the newsstand, I was lucky to catch this boy hopping, or whatever he's doing, tying a shoelace, I don't know. But street photography, candid photography involves a little bit of luck. You know, you don't know exactly the little things that are going to happen. Compositionally, the arc of the trees is kind of nice, the way it frames the picture. And he's taking a breather, maybe after loading or unloading the truck. The architectural elements behind him add a sense of time and place. And I also like the expression on his face and so on. Well, his grandson, maybe, taking a breather. Now, in case you didn't recognize him, he's maybe not that guy's grandson, but I wouldn't mind if he were mine, LeBron James. She's barefoot in Central Park Zoo. You can see her shoot right behind the tree. She's cooling off in the summer. When I printed this picture initially, I also printed it in the reverse, so what is light is dark and so on, to make it a bit more dramatic. I was thinking of using it as a cover of an art and literary magazine in high school, which was named Cargoes. I didn't like this guy when I first took the picture. He reminded me of a rodent, kind of glaring at me with nuts in his cheek and eating his lunch, but I've really come to like him, I must say. Now, I understand that he is the cover boy for his dental plan, and you should see him smile. Yeah. Okay. This is a funeral in New York, and they're all carrying their handkerchiefs. The person must have been somebody who was loved. And a close-up. What I kind of like about this is the sense of time and place. The hairstyles on the women, the pearls, the dresses, the bonnets, and so on. It really brings you back to the early 50s. He's about to rest his derriere for a lunch break. And I resonate with this picture because I also used to fish in Sheepshead Bay for snappers, which are baby bluefish. But we know as kids grow up, they see greater challenges and bigger game. And I guess now he likes to fish in the Ukraine. Brotherhood Week in Crimea. I understand that he's prepping for a head-to-head bout with Sylvester Stallone for Rambo 5. Is Nina here? I told you I would do this. These guys are playing scout in Central Park, spying on people maybe. 10 years later, I'm sorry, Justin, I didn't know you were going to do it. Diane Arbus did this picture. And you gotta wonder about this boy. I mean, who knows? But, as they say, the difference between men and boys is the price of their toys. Do you all recognize him? Well, this was me back then. And when Norm saw this picture, it was a self-portrait, he said, well, maybe that's why you could get up close to people and not be too threatening, because you were so young and innocent looking. Maybe he's right. This was one of my favorite pictures from the time, and I'd always given it the name Bowery Boy, and I blew it up when I was a kid. And I've been looking at this face for a long time, and I figured I would recognize him anywhere. I just thought he was something else. And 2 months ago, walking out of the men's room at the Landmark Theater in Los Angeles, there he was. Maybe not quite as cute as I remembered him. Maybe it wasn't even him. Well, now I've got to move ahead and show you the good stuff. My wife and I began to collect American art almost 30 years ago. We were initially attracted to tonalist paintings done at the end of the 19th century. These were often quiet, evocative, poetic landscapes. Evening and early morning were favorite times of day. Colors were muted and invited emotional resonance. This is Georginus, and it's called The Bathers. It was done in Montclair, New Jersey. And it's done at sundown. The colors are glowing and mysterious. The women are disrobing, about to take a dip in the pond below. The men are working on the haystacks. Innes was a follower of the philosopher Swedenborg, who believed that the Spirit of God is present throughout the natural world. We pick frames that are appropriate for the paintings. This frame is a Barbizon frame. Somebody once said, the frame is pimp to the painting. George Bellows, Breaking Sky, Monhegan. It's a simple painting, but very bold, and it shows his beautiful brushwork. 1911. Monhegan was known as the Artist's Island in Maine. John Lafarge went down to the Bayou Teche in Louisiana to woo his future bride, and did this lovely lyrical painting one morning. Commodore Perry's granddaughter was his future bride. And this is another Lafarge, Venus Anadyomene emerging from the sea. Dwight Tryon is one of my favorite painters, and he painted in Deerfield, just up the road. And as we drove up to Williamstown the other day, we saw Tryon birch trees all over the place, these ghost-like, sensitive, delicate trees. In this painting, there's a farmer who is tilling his land. There's a fire behind him, a stone wall, some mountain lavender, and these marvelous trees that are in many of his paintings. He spent 37 years on the faculty and as a professor of art at Smith. This is another Tryon, and it's a pastel. It's done the same year, late afternoon, same size as the other painting. Portraiture is another interest of ours. My professional work involves the emotional lives of others, and many of my photographs are kind of up-close portraits. Abbott Henderson Thayer did his second wife, and with her glance and the tilt of her head, it becomes more than just another portrait. And John Singer Sargent is an American icon, but he did this painting in Worcester, also somewhat down the road, in 1890, and it's of Royal Elisha Robbins, who was the founder of Wolf and Watch. And Robbins had come through a serious illness. His company was having a hard time. And Sargent caught the melancholy and fatigue in the sitter in this limited palette portrait. The frame, by the way, is by Stanford White, the great American esthetician and frame maker and architect. These photographs, by the way, are not professional. They're my own photographs in the house, so you can see, fortunately, the shadows and so on. But a Chinese bowl and some plums. Frederick Barley was a Canadian group of 7 painter. Did this triple portrait of Vincent Massey, who was then the Governor General of Canada. Varley was in the Canadian group of 7. Painting was done around 1920 or 21. Rico Lebrun did this crucifixion painting about 3 or 4 blocks away from where we live in Brentwood, Los Angeles. And he was inspired by the great Grunewald altarpiece done in 1512. This was the first major acquisition that we made. It was a sculpture by Marc de Souverain called Pirouette Bourguignon, and the top part spins on this, it's torch-cut steel, spins above. Over time, our collection expanded to include bronze sculptures from the 19th century, American portrait miniatures on ivory, these little 2-inch miniatures that were done before the invention of photography in the 1840s, as a way of people having a record of loved ones and themselves. And we also have many ancient Chinese jades. These are a few of the jades. Kuan Yin, a main jade, and below it, a Warring States blade from about 30 to 3,300 years ago. Uncle Abe by George Bissell. When I say our collections have expanded to fill our walls and tabletops, I kid you not. It scares my wife, frankly. Ulrich did tea roses of an Italian model. Many of the artists in our collection were American expatriates who went to Europe in between 1876 and 1912 during the American Renaissance, as it was called, or the Gilded Age. Elihu Vedder, a girl with a lute. Vedder painted this in Paris, but he spent most of his expatriate years in Italy. In the mead, there's a lovely little Vedder called Etruscan Girl. There's another Vedder, done the same year, windy day. I couldn't resist buying a little French painting by Fantin Latour, a marine painting. John Twachtman is another favorite artist of mine. This is his son Godfrey in a christening dress. Rockwell Kent is a fascinating artist. Started out studying architecture at Columbia, became an artist, traveled from Newfoundland to Mohegan Island. This painting was done, in Resurrection Bay, Alaska in 1918, killer whales in Resurrection Bay. You would consider this an American modernist painting. He also traveled to the southern tip of South America as well. There's a Rockwell Kent in the Mead that I think is of his farm in the Adirondacks. 50 years before that, Ralph Blakelock, a visionary artist, did Silvery Moon. Powerful and very Patrick Henry Bruce, inspired by Cezanne in 1912, did this early modernist painting. This is one of my wife's favorites, Nantucket by Edwin Dickinson in the 40s. He was kind of an artist. One of my favorites. Starry Night Echo Park. Carlos Amherst was the foremost figure in the Los Angeles Chicano movement of painters. And, you can guess what artists may have influenced him on this one. I'll show you a couple of portrait miniatures, just so you know what I'm talking about. On ivory, about 2 inches high. Malbone was America's leading portrait miniaturist. In 1803, he painted Colonel Izard, a revolutionary hero, and I think a governor of one of the states, I forget. Another portrait miniature around the same time. This was a mourning portrait. Frequently, people would have portrait miniatures done of loved ones who had died, and this poor young woman died young. From the smallest painting in our collection to the largest, like 6 feet tall, on floor on the Normandy coast. Still looks very much like that. Not the sailing ships, but the waterfront painting. He did this when he was a graduate student in art. And another contemporary, Bloody Mary, not for his ear, believe it or not, but named because his mentor, John Koch, once did a painting of a woman walking in her New York apartment carrying a Bloody Mary and the sun streaming through it. So I guess he named this one for that reason. Richard Diebenkorn is many people's favorite abstract painter. At least he's one of ours. This is Ocean Park, and you can see how he leaves the partially rubbed out ghost-like trials and earlier attempts, which add enormous richness to the painting. And Jasper Johns, 0 through 9 in lead. And finally, Gray Moses by Andrea Serrano. This is a diptych about 8 feet tall. He used to take little plaster models and put them in fluids and photograph them. This was done in water. Some of them were in blood or urine. And one made him infamous with Jesse Helms from the National whatever. And I'm not going to describe that too much here. Oh, okay. This is the risky part of it. to my own paintings. 15 years ago, I began to paint again. Initially, I was intimidated by the accomplishments of artists whom I admired. Such works, fortunately, became inspirational. I often wish that I could paint in the quiet, monochromatic tones of those artists whom we love and collect, but as a painting progresses, the final result is invariably vivid and colorful rather than restrained. I just can't fight my own DNA. When a painting is finished, I thankfully feel as though I've emerged from a battle with myself. When I started painting, I did watercolors of flowers and still lifes. And this was the first oil of Datura. I painted on our patio, but because of changing light and everything, it was hard to do that. So we built a studio above the garage where I continued to paint. This is a watercolor done on Lake Millinocket at Libby's fishing camp from the porch of the camp where we stayed one twilight. I often brought my paints along with me on vacations and trips. This was done from our cabin window in Algonquin Park. And I did another one right there as well. Fishing with my son, fly fishing in the Deschutes River in Oregon. The still life, spirit stone and Aitiki from some objects from the mantle in our living room. Now this is good stuff. This is Eduardo Chillida, who I consider one of the great sculptors of the 20th century, in San Sebastian. These are about 4 large sculptures, maybe 15, 20 feet of steel, and they're set in cliffs and rocks overlooking the ocean, and the waves crash into them, and the spray comes up through them. And I was just so blown away by his sculptures and his foundation, which is in San Sebastian. And when I came home, I did a series of paintings just to memorialize the experience. Now, my wife and I, Sandra and me, did a drawing group for about 5 or 6 years with other artists in the neighborhood in somebody's garage studio. But she got divorced and moved, so the group stopped. And we would draw from the model, and that's one model. So I did a little sketch that I hope you'll be forgiving with me. It was kind of quick and unfinished, but just to give you an idea of the kind of stuff I was doing then. You have to give me latitude on this. Okay. But seriously, this is my grandson Will, and he was 2 years old at the time. And I did an earlier picture of him when he was just an infant in a different style. You pardon me, John Van Eyck, whom I borrowed from the Huntington Museum. But Will truly has grown up. He's 15 years old yesterday. And he's lost his blonde hair. He has dark hair now. His features have changed, but he's still quite cute. You don't think so? I think so. Okay. We're in Japan and in Hiroshima, and I was kind of taking notes of the last survivor building at Point Zero, and the crane landed on the roof and came back to the studio, and from a photograph that I took of the roof structure and the building, did this painting. You can't really see it here, but in the atomic cloud behind the crane, there are, I put in faces to commemorate the dead Hiroshima. We were on a trip to the southeast, and I did a watercolor of the governor's house from the porch of our B&B across the street, and then did this oil painting when I got home. You can see that there's a little bit of the voyeur in me. And the same story here, Savannah, Georgia. I was sort of entranced by the kind of ghost-like Leviathan images of the ships coming down the river at night, turning around and going out to sea. This ship was a cargo ship from China. My wife and I take walks in the Palisades Park in Santa Monica. This was an ink sketch and another ink. Coming back from Japan, I was motivated to do some paintings of some of the things that I saw. This was the Great Torii Gate, a Shinto shrine in Miyashima Island. It sits out in the water. And I put kanji all around it. The kanji, the Japanese characters that mean here heaven, water, shrine, sun, and so on. You can see what I mean when I say my paintings always turn out very colorful. They're hardly toneless paintings. Yeah. And this, we were all bombarded by images on CNN in 2003, shock and awe. I call this one April in Baghdad. It was just an imaginary painting, but some veterans who have seen it, who were there, said, you know, it really did look very much like that. The village, just an imaginary painting. Okay. This is a little bit of my idiosyncratic side, I'm afraid to say. I put a couple of our jades in this kind of tropical setting with orchids. This was a moth wizard from the Zhou dynasty about 1200 BC, and a Geo monster from the 6th dynasty, 300-400 AD. And when I was putting this slideshow together a couple of weeks ago, I realized that in doing this painting, I was probably unconsciously influenced by paintings by Martin Johnson Heade, whom I like very much, who in the Amazon would put hummingbirds with orchids. And I didn't realize it at the time, but, you know, anybody denies the unconscious, let them talk to me. An abstract painting. And another one. And often after doing an abstract painting, I'm motivated to do something else. And this was a painting that I saw at the Norton Simon, and I just loved it. And the next day, with a mirror and whatnot, I wanted to do a self-portrait. Not Van Gogh, but my version of Monhegan Island, sitting in the same place, pretty much that George Bellows did his Breaking Sky Mohegan that I showed you before. Xi'an, China. It's another kanji painting of the inland sea, a crane, sun, pine tree, kanji in the water. So here are the contemporary pictures that I did, having rediscovered photography, partially motivated by the forthcoming presentation that I'm doing today. And I bought a new wonderful camera. I don't know, Justin, whether you're familiar with this little Sony camera. It's great. It's got a glass lens, a Tessar lens. You can hold it in the palm of your hand, put it in your coat pocket, take it with you, and a flip-back LCD viewfinder that you can shoot candid shots from the waist. So these are pictures that I took last spring and over the summer. And I just love the leering look on this guy. And she's probably thinking, oh God, what am I in for? At the same Cuban restaurant. Smartphones are everywhere. You know, these are images of our times. I wanted to capture the fun and dynamism and electricity of our age in Los Angeles. And they're in quite dynamic contrast to the 1952 pictures, that caught a different time. Although I must say that in 1952, Winograd was also photographing, but he was photographing in Midtown Manhattan, and he caught a lot of the energy and excitement and different kinds of images than the ones that I shot in the Bowery and the Boroughs. As you can see, my interest in people, the subtleties of expression, little things are important to me in the kind of street photography that I do. What would a slideshow be without a couple of hotties? We went to a photography exhibit of some vintage crime scene photographs in Hollywood, and I was interested in the people who came to the show as well. This is an actual photograph from a crime scene. Some other people looking at the exhibit. It's a different photography exhibit. Some nice faces. Now, is that a face? I mean, I would not leave until I got a good picture of her on the Santa Monica Mall. He's pretty cute too. Check out his t-shirt. Some faces around Santa Monica or so on. These young guys were mesmerized by a street magician on the mall. Now, 3 guesses where this is. The Genius Bar at the local Apple store. Along the Palisades Park. Can you guess who he'd like to be? Now these 4 Hispanic women, I don't remember what was happening, but they look somewhat aghast, but it all turned out well. And this guy was blowing bubbles from his van, and I love the little sign on the door, "Life is a beach." Okay, my son and I were at a local beer bar and hamburger bar, and this fellow was proposing. He had a ring, and he looks a bit worried, but it turned out okay. And she's happy too. But I also like the light and dark in this picture. And these guys are always working out whenever we take a walk. I just picked one of many photographs. This little cutie was just fascinated by the leaf. And I liked the way the pattern on her dress with the flowers and the leaves echoed the rose garden behind her. This is a different kind of leaf that's sold in Venice Beach. If any of you have not been to Venice Beach, it's a scene. I know Justin, some of your photographs of your own were from there a while ago. This fellow is shyly watching the bodybuilders in Muscle Beach. What's kind of nice compositionally about this is the way the structure, the architectural structure echoes the anatomy. Now, is she getting a lesson in relativity or not? One memory I have from my freshman year at Amherst, April 18th, 1953, Arnold Boris Ahrens, if any of you remember him, came in to physics lecture and said there will be no lecture today. Albert Einstein died. But there it is. Some interesting faces again in Santa Monica. I love the hat that this little girl had. Reminds me of Chagall paintings in some ways, a horse's head and the colors and everything. And this is Little Women 2014. You might remember the first picture I showed you from 1952. This is Father's Day at LA County Museum. This little guy was painting in a room adjacent to the Korean exhibit at the museum. And finally, these lovely young women were standing in an outdoor sculpture on the patio of the museum. I want to take a minute to tell you what I'm doing next. I have an exhibit of all of my work at a rather outstanding architectural new museum in Carlton, Oregon. That's such a brilliant piece of architecture that I took a photograph of it to share with you. And that's it. Okay, how do I get this off?
Close it?
Yeah, let's close it. That's it.
Bottom.
On here?
Yeah, bottom button. Should go to black screen.
Thank you, Paul, for your wonderful speech. It was really fascinating, and I really enjoyed listening to it. And I hope all of you will join us at the meet, where there'll be a reception, a chance to look at Paul's photographs, and a chance to ask him any questions you may have about his work. I hope you'll take the opportunity to introduce yourselves. And thank you again. Please join me in thanking Paul one last time, and